Hello everyone. Hello. Um, we're going to go down memory lane, and this is what I used to look like a million years ago. Well, 35 years ago, something like that. I was 28, 26, 27, let's just say 27. And I was in grad school in Madison, Wisconsin, and I was knee deep, neck deep, over my head in artwork. Actually, over my head is the right word for it. In artwork that I was making, where I would construct what I called three-dimensional drawings. And everything you see in this picture, with the exception of yours truly, was made of Strathmore paper, Bristol board, and ink wash. And everything was life-size. This chair, that stove, that easel, that stretcher, that samovar was all made of this paper, and I would create the tonality using ink wash, India ink, pen and ink, and ink wash. And for example, a close-up of a croquet ball and mallet are here. So you can see that there are little hatch line work and pieces of paper. You see the seams of the paper where I would glue them together, glue them down. It wasn't paper mache, no. It wasn't origami, no. It was something else. You got me. What do we call it? So here is two paint stirrers. They're 84, Pierre Gustafson 84 PG. I used to sign my name that way with a little sort of monogram thing. 1984, so that was 40 years ago. What 2000, whenever. 1984. You do the math. I have no idea even what year it is. So two paint stirrers that are glued together, which is what happens when you put one wet paint stirrer on top of another wet paint stirrer, and that's what you get. So that's what this is. Here you see a little, paper I folded over, glued this thing on there, and then I drew some lines and then cross-hatched or hatched. And I was a realist. I drew what I saw, and if the thing had a ding or a dent on it, I drew the ding or a dent. So right now, zooming ahead to whatever year we're in, 2019, is that what we're in? 2019, at the DeYoung Art Museum in San Francisco, California, there is a piece of mine which is on display, and a number of people have told me that they have seen it, and I got a list of questions from someone today which I will answer. Rather than typing the answers out, I decided I would make this video. This is the piece that is owned by the DeYoung Museum. It's called Father's Suitcase. And this is my father's suitcase. It's shown here upside down, I guess. On the flip side of it, it has WMG with gold lettering right on the other side of the suitcase, and rather discreet Roman lettering. I have this suitcase right now in my storage corner. And that little thing right there, that little tag right there, I think that says sold. It was very cute. I have to go down, that's another memory down memory lane. So here is the suitcase. It's life size. It's the size of the actual suitcase. And I will show you how I made it, kind of, if I can. What I would do is I would take, for something as large as this, oh, by the way, this thing here, this thing here, this was the third room of a 3-room suite. Floors, ceilings, walls were all constructed of paper, or finished with paper. I did have wood holding it all together, and sometimes tag board. I don't think I used any wire. I guess there were some nails holding the stretchers to, the stage set aspect of it together, but there was everything you looked at was paper. The light that came into the inside of the rooms, when you walked in, you were completely surrounded by paper. There was tracing paper on what would have been the windows, and there was light coming in through the tracing paper illuminating the scene. So it was never quite this bright, but pretty bright. You could see what you were looking at. But it looked like you were inside of a black and white movie, almost. Everything was black and white. It looked real to a degree until you looked at it closely, and you saw that it was made of paper and drawn with ink. So anyway, this is how I made something like the suitcase, except I'm going to, where's the scissors? There's the scissors. And I had glue and paper. So let me find a piece of paper. So first of all, let's say I wanted to make the suitcase. I would, in my head, or sometimes on a piece of paper, I would sort of sketch out what I needed to do. Essentially, a suitcase is a rectangular thing, so I needed 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 large surfaces. And so I cut out pieces of cardboard that were the size, 2 big ones, 2 small ones, etc. And then sometimes I would fold the piece of, this is often pieces of crescent board, illustration board. So, this sort of thing became the rounded corner of the suitcase, or could be, could start out that way. And then I would build up layers, or sometimes if I wanted it to be a little less severe, I would, cut things like this and bend it down like that to make it slightly more rounded. And then I would use, I'm using tape here just because I don't have time to glue these things. I'd take a piece of paper, strips of paper. I would cut hundreds and hundreds of thousands of strips of paper that I would then slather with glue, and then I would take the glue and glue it like that. Hold it tight, and then I would then do the same thing with the other elements. So here's, let's say, the side of the suitcase, and I might tear that off or fold it or whatever to fit in that spot, and I would tape these down. And eventually I would get the overall shape of the suitcase. Now this suitcase, for decorative and perhaps strength purposes, had these diagonal straps that were sewn on the surface. And in that case, I believe I just took a piece of crescent board and covered it with paper and then glued it a crescent board strip covered with paper, and then I would glue it down on the surface. And then I would, do the same thing with these hinged or sewn on corners. And then I'd add all of the rest of the parts, building them and gluing them on. The handles, a cross section of a handle might be, made of 3 or 4 pieces of foam core, or not foam core, but the crescent board cardboard, and then I would wrap paper around it like this to make it rounded. The metal rings that are here were made of just a piece of paper. I was buying, 2 and 3 and 4 ply pieces of Strathmore Bristol board to create these things. I would take a piece of maybe 2 or 3 ply paper like this, and then I would slather it with glue and then make it into a ring like that. So that's how that was made. The sale sign, this little tiny tag here. When I had a show in Boston, when I first moved to Boston, I had an art show of this work, which was shipped out in huge shipping crates. And as one does at, what's the word I want? Art shows, that's art exhibits. When someone buys something, they put a little red dot next to it, a little tiny red dot. And the gallery director, there was no place to put red dots on here. We put them, maybe he was going to put them next to the label, I guess. But when they were in a room, like this, a 3-dimensional room, there's no wall to stick a label on because you'd be sticking it on an actual art piece. So I said, well, I'll make little sale tags, sold tags. So I cut out little tags, put a little hole in it, wrote the word sold, used ink wash and a little paper string, and we would glue it onto the piece. And so that's what that is. That's the sold sticker. When this was sold, we attached that. That was not part of the original piece, but it became part of the piece, I guess, after it sold. Isn't that clever of me? Okay, let's read some of these questions. The person who's asking these questions is a docent at the Fine Art Museum. And the work titled Father's Suitcase, Wells Malcolm Gustafson. I don't remember naming it with my father's real name on it, but I guess I did. An old suitcase, wonder why it's considered a work of art. And then they have the aha moment. Oh, I see. The people think it's a real suitcase. It's just sitting on a pedestal or wherever it is. And then they see that it's created of paper. Which, that aha moment was quite often what people would have when they looked at my work. They'd look at it and they'd look at it again and look at it and they find, oh my God, it's not real. Well, it is real. It's just not made of leather. It's made of paper. So how the questions are following. How is it constructed? Well, I've explained that. So yes, the pieces this is hollow. It does not contain anything other than the inside of the cardboard, and there's no shirts and underwear and things like that on the inside. It's hollow, and but it's also not solid. People often think that I've just taken a piece of styrofoam and cut it to this shape and then put paper on top of it. But no, it is hollow. It's constructed similarly to how I showed you. Okay, structural supports within the piece to keep it from collapsing. Well, it's not that heavy. When I did larger pieces, I did have to use sometimes wood to hold it up. Adhesive was Sobo glue, though at the time I made this I was just using good old Elmer's glue. Layers of paper binded together. How do you achieve a texture which resembles worn leather bag? Do you use scratch, scour, or wash off the ink? No, it's all additive. I would mix, I'd use ink wash, and I would dip my brush into gray ink and smush it around, and if I wanted it darker I would use darker, denser ink. And then if there are scuffs and scours it's on it that are real, that might be, but most of them are drawn on. Are the threads that hold the tags onto the thin threads hold the tags onto the handle? Are they made of cotton thread, or are they also made of paper? They are made of paper, as I showed you. It's funny, when this piece was purchased by it turned out one of my neighbors here in my building, though we didn't live here at the time, but he ended up living here, and then he moved to California, and 30 years ago he moved to California, or 25 years ago maybe, and at some point he donated this to the museum, and in its 30 years of being moved around the country, the handle broke off. The little piece of paper was somehow damaged, and it could have been damaged by someone thinking it was a real suitcase and just yanking it up and tearing it. That's happened before. People have sat on chairs that look like chairs, and I've had to spend more time repairing them than I did creating them, which is often the case when you do repair work. So what I did, the technician who fixed this for display, I told her what to do, what she needed to do, and I sent her paper. But because paper fades, this used to be white. The lightest part of this used to be white, or slightly off-white. And any new paper I would buy would be bright white compared to this. So I took a piece of art that I had. It was this basement. This was a basement. This had pieces of stray lumber that you might find in a basement, and no one wanted to buy that stuff. That was sort of, the cast of thousands in the background of the movie. It was there for textural realism rather than for beauty's sake. But I had pieces of work that was equally old as this, and I had to take it apart to provide the paper that was faded and correctly the same age as this. So, and I explained to them how to reattach them. I think the tags had also fallen off. Okay, back to here. Okay, so many of us have seen a suitcase like this in a parent or grandparent's home, and the stories these bags could tell. Did your father really have a bag like this? Yes, he did. Now I have it. I mean, he's still alive, but I have the actual suitcase. If yes, did it accompany him on journeys or trains or planes or long car rides, visiting friends, relatives, or employment? Well, he would often go to New York City and sometimes elsewhere for work, and that's probably when the suitcase was used. It may have accompanied my dad and my mother on their vacations they took. when I was a child, but I don't, and this could have been on vacations with us when we were kids, but as often happens when you're traveling, you end up finding lighter, more versatile suitcases than this. And so consequently, this was sort of discarded in the basement and no longer used by him, and I used it whenever I would go home to Minneapolis. My dad was in the clothing business, and his size of suit was essentially the same as my size of suit, so he would have to stay fashionable, but I could be a couple of years in the past. So I would fill up suitcases at home. I would go home with either no suitcases or empty suitcases, and I'd come back with full suitcases that I would fill up at home from my father's closet. And consequently, this is when bags were free, by the way, on the airplane. And consequently, I have lots of suitcases here, and there's not that many in Minneapolis right now. Do the tags for Philadelphia and Baltimore, Washington have a story behind them? Well, I think my father went to a clothing thing in Philadelphia. Baltimore, Washington, I don't think he ever specifically went there, though the airplane may have gone there on its way to New York. Because the suitcase looks so worn, it seems it had been often used. What's the story this suitcase is meant to tell? Well, now you're getting onto territory that I didn't really plan to tell necessarily in the work that I was creating. I maybe wanted you to think to the past when you were inside of this room. When you were inside of this room or inside of one of my pieces, I think it was sort of like you were remembering the past, whether it was your past or the past that I had, though you wouldn't know what that was. It's hard to tell. I mean, this work, I haven't made this work in nearly 30 years, work of this type. So it's hard for me to remember what I was thinking when I was making this. Why did you choose to create a worn suitcase as its subject? Or I'm sorry, I missed a thing. What do you want people to feel when seeing it? I don't know how to answer that. Sorry. It isn't. See how clever I am at making this thing look real out of paper. That really wasn't what I wanted people to think, though that often is what people did think. Why did you choose to create a worn suitcase as a subject? In this case, there were certain things that I did create, and there were other things I did not create. I chose to create objects that I personally liked. I avoided things that I couldn't create in a manner that I thought made any sense. For example, back in those days, we all had stereos, hi-fis with plastic, see-through dust covers, I guess they were called. And I didn't know how I would do that. How would I make something that was transparent out of paper? So I could have used tracing paper, maybe, or Mylar, but somehow that seemed like it wasn't right. It was cheating somehow. There were rules that I had. I also didn't draw things that were alive. I did draw things that were alive at one point, like dead fish that were mounted on a board. I drew that. But I didn't draw something that was meant to be a live cat sleeping in the corner. This piece was exhibited in an installation of other 3D drawings that also included items like a piano and chairs. Were these items meant to form a unified scene? If yes, what was the scene about? Well, the actual scene, this was the second of 3 rooms you'd walk through. The first room was the furnace room of the house I lived in Madison, with 2 furnaces and hot water heaters and various other things. And then you'd walk through that into this back room that had the back stairs going up to the floor above, and also a door that went out to the backyard. And I loved that room, or those rooms in the basement. And I liked the fact that they sort of contained lots of discarded things that were sort of too good to be thrown out, or maybe they belonged to someone that lived there before and maybe they'll come back to get it. But it was all part of a scene. And so anyway, here we go. So it was, yes, a unified scene. Does the suitcase contain anything inside? Words, letters, clothing made of paper, or a toothbrush made of paper? No, it's empty, as I said. I don't do this work any longer, and part of the reason for that was there was a time when I was doing this kind of work, and I also started doing flat drawings, illustrations for a magazine about fountain pens. And at the time when I started doing these articles, these illustrations for these articles about magazines, I started doing things that were more interesting to me than creating this kind of artwork. And you know, I would have a page and I would want to illustrate a pen nib, let's say, pen point, close up, magnified. Do I show it from the front, or do I show it from the side? Do I show it diagonal? Do I show it vertical? Do I show it with a shadow? And all of this information that I was processing, you know, I'd try one thing, you know, and the drawing would tell me, this is pretty boring, Peer, you can do better than that. I was having dialogue between the drawing that I was making and myself. I wasn't having that with these. These were mute. I would have the conversation like these when I was thinking about what I was going to draw and maybe how I would place it in the environment that I was making. But the actual creation of these things was pretty one-sided. I picked the piece, I measured it, I created it, I built the framework, I covered it with paper, I covered it with ink, but it was relatively one-sided. And when I started doing these illustrations, I really missed the conversations I was having as I was creating a flat drawing. I thought of these things as drawings, 3-dimensional drawings. I really love drawing, but I was spending 99.9% of the time creating this structure upon which I was going to draw. And I felt, why am I spending so much time? It's like building a stretcher to do a painting on. If it took me 99% of the time to build the stretcher to do a painting, I'd give up painting and do something else. Because why am I spending so much time? So it was going back to flat drawings where I was dealing with choices of composition mainly, which I really missed when I was doing this work here. So I switched. And I look at the work I did back then, and that handsome young man that I used to be back then, and I think, yeah, this was pretty fun to do at the time. But these days, I think I'm having more fun doing drawings that, these are things I just did using my fountain pens and purple ink and spit to create this finger painting. I'm having more fun creating this kind of stuff. Sometimes I delve into three-dimensional things. I'm making a bunch of masks for a mask, not so much a show, but a workshop I'm going to have with kids. And I was trying to come up with ways to create three-dimensional masks very simply using just a piece of paper and some tape or some staples. Let me just show you some drawings I did recently. I'm a member of the Boston chapter of the Urban Sketchers group, and I really love it because I'm able to draw on flat pieces of paper with crayon or pen and ink or pencil. And we go to a place that usually has an object or a thing that most tourists would take a picture of to show that they were there. And in this case it was Old North Church. 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, 3 if by Uber. And the church, you know, looks like this. What does Old North Church look like? You know, it has this thing and this thing and a door and some windows, and it has, you know, this 3-story steeple. I'm making it all out of proportion here. Looks like this, sort of. And there's, you know, columns and doodads and, you know, typical la-di-da architecture. It was in vogue at that time. So I went there and I drew, the first drawing I did was this one. Of course you can't see the whole thing. There. And, you know, yes, that's what most people look at and most people draw. Excuse me, but I wanted it to be seen. I love angles and how things interact, and here we have the side of Old North Church with its big arched window, and this is whatever is next to it. Old, slightly less northerly church there, or some building, I don't know what it is. So I'm fascinated by architecture. Here are 2 buildings next to each other. This one, the floors, the stories are maybe an extra foot taller, so the 3-story building is 3 feet taller than this one. And it's just, I love the change of architecture. So the composition, you know, deciding what to draw and how much sky am I going to make. And here's another picture of Old North Church. There's the steeple. But that wasn't what was interesting to me. It was this weird building next to it. Here's Old North Church again, seen from the side. So I really have fun doing these sorts of drawings. White on black. There's another same kind of thing. This church looming up over the dark shadows. Next to Old North Church is a little George Washington Park. It's about the size of a 1-bedroom apartment. And there's a little fountain that doesn't work anymore. And this is a broken bench So anyway, I still draw the same kinds of things that I used to make out of paper. Old stuff, worn stuff, broken things, things that show show history, show life, show age. And anyway, so that's what I do. This is what I do now. I use an iPad to draw. I use pen and ink to draw. I use pens that are 100 years old. This is from 1923. Well, maybe 1929. Anyway, it's an old pen. So, there you go. If you have any other questions, let me know. Thanks for allowing me to go down memory lane. Yep.